In this video, I'm going to show you how to make these fluffy, flaky, golden and moist buttermilk biscuits entirely from scratch. And we'll get right into it. In a large mixing bowl, we're going to add 3 cups of all-purpose flour. Next, you're going to add 1.5 tablespoons of aluminum-free baking powder. The aluminum will cause the biscuits to have a metal-like taste. Then we're going to add 1/4 teaspoon of baking soda, as well as 1/2 teaspoon of cream of tartar. The cream of tartar is what will help to neutralize the metallic taste in the baking soda once it's activated. I just added a 1/2 tablespoon of iodized salt, and finally I'm going to add a 1/2 tablespoon of white granulated sugar as well. And now we're just going to whisk all of the ingredients until they're combined. And once all of the dry ingredients are combined, we're going to move on to adding our butter. And what we're going to do in this step is we're going to grate 3/4 cups or 1.5 sticks of frozen unsalted butter. It's best that you use cold or even frozen butter for this recipe. The reason why is because softened or melted butter would get incorporated into the flour too quickly, which would lead to gluten development, which would prevent the biscuits from rising properly and lead to less flakiness and a tougher biscuit. By the way, I'm using a hand grater in this recipe. You can also use a box grater. And the reason why I recommend grating the butter is once you're ready to blend it in with the other ingredients, it will be a lot easier to do so versus if you were dicing them up into squares or cubes. And now what I'm doing is I'm stirring in the butter with the dry ingredients until everything's just combined. And next I'm going to use my pastry blender to grind the butter into extremely small pea-sized pieces. This step will ensure the butter is evenly spread throughout all of the biscuit dough. So once you put the biscuits in the oven, the butter will create a lot of steam, and this will ensure all of the biscuits get a sufficient amount of steam to form those pretty flaky layers that you saw at the beginning of the video. So that's how your flour mixture should look once the butter is blended. And moving on to the next step, I have 1.5 cups of buttermilk, and what I'm going to do is add a 1/2 tablespoon of honey to the buttermilk. And once I finish adding the honey to the buttermilk, I'm going to stir the honey, and once I stir the honey, I'm going to stir it until it's well combined with the buttermilk. And we're going to stir the honey until it's no longer visible. And the reason we're doing this is the honey is a lot easier to incorporate if you first add it to the buttermilk before attempting to incorporate it into the biscuit dough. Alright, so now that we finished stirring the honey inside the buttermilk, we are ready to move on to our next step. And that is pouring our buttermilk into the bowl with the dry ingredients. And once we finish adding the buttermilk, the next step is to mix the buttermilk in with the dry ingredients until just combined. Now you want to be really careful with this step because, as mentioned earlier, you don't want to overwork the dough, because if you do, you'll end up with gluten development, which will again prevent the biscuits from rising properly. So I've mixed everything until it's just combined. And that's how your dough should look. Sticky but a bit shaggy. And before we move on to our next step, we're going to make our egg wash. We're going to brush this on top of our biscuits before we place them in the oven. So I'm going to beat the egg for 15 seconds, and I used an extra large egg for this. And once I finish with that, I'm going to add 1 tablespoon of heavy whipping cream. Some recipes call for milk, some recipes call for water. I've tested both. Water leads to too much browning of the biscuits, whereas milk doesn't lead to enough browning. Ultimately, I find that heavy whipping cream offers the ideal amount of browning for the biscuits. So now that we finish our egg wash, we're going to move on to kneading our biscuit dough. So we're going to dump the biscuit dough onto a clean surface along with the excess flour that will be in your bowl. And I'm going to knead the dough just until it's combined. You don't want to knead it for too long. You just want to knead it long enough to where you're able to begin folding it into layers. And once you start folding it into the layers, you're going to want to fold it no more than 4 to 6 times. In addition to the butter, this will also give the biscuits that flakiness that we saw at the beginning of the video. In any event you find the dough is still a bit too wet or sticky, you can always add a bit more flour onto the surface or the dough itself. And once we finish folding the dough, we're going to move on to flattening the dough. And there are 2 ways you can go about this. You can either use a rolling pin or you can pat out the dough by hand. As you can see, I'm using a rolling pin in this video, but there are really pros and cons to both methods. Now, one benefit to using the rolling pin is the rolling pin will ensure that your biscuits all share an even height, as well as ensure the biscuits all have a even surface once you place them in the oven. On the other hand, perhaps the biggest drawback of using the rolling pin, you do risk flattening the dough too much, and when you flatten the dough too much, it won't rise as well. On the other hand, if you were to pat out the biscuit dough with your hand, there's less risk of overworking the dough. However, and this is a pro for the rolling pin, you may not get biscuits that are flattened as evenly. So now what I'm doing is I'm using the biscuit cutter to form the biscuits, and I flatten the dough into 1-inch thickness. And you want to be careful not to twist the biscuit cutter when forming the biscuits. If you twist the biscuit cutter, you'll risk closing off the sides of the biscuit, which will again prevent it from rising properly. And now what I'm doing is I'm placing the biscuits on my baking sheet. I line my baking sheet with parchment paper. You can use parchment paper or you can grease it with oil. Ultimately, the purpose of the parchment paper or the oil is to ensure the biscuits don't stick to the bottom as they bake. If it turns out that you have any leftover dough, what you would do is just pull all of the dough back together and flatten it out once more. And for this recipe, it depends on what size biscuit cutter you use. I used a 2.75-inch biscuit cutter, but if you use a smaller biscuit cutter, say a 2.5-inch size biscuit cutter, you may be able to squeeze as many as 15 biscuits out of this recipe. Now in this video, I only made 12 biscuits, or a dozen, and I'm going to put those last 3 biscuits onto my cookie sheet now. And if you notice while looking at the baking sheet, all of the biscuits are touching each other. And the reason for that is because when you put those biscuits in the oven, they will all lean on each other for growth in order to lift themselves up. So you want to ensure that your biscuits are touching each other when you place them in the oven. And now I'm going to brush the top of the biscuits with the egg wash I made earlier. Now I know there are some recipes that may call for brushing butter on top of the biscuits before you place them in the oven. I don't recommend that because you'll just end up burning up the biscuits once they're exposed to the heat. And now we're going to bake the biscuits in a preheated oven at 425 degrees for around 12 to 15 minutes. In this video, I allowed the biscuits to bake for around 13 minutes, and now I'm going to allow them to cool. I recommend allowing the biscuits to cool for around 5 to 10 minutes before serving them. And these go great as a side dish with bacon and eggs, or even as a side dish for dinner with, say, fried chicken. And while there's nothing wrong with store-bought biscuits in a pinch, you can never beat fresh baked hot biscuits made at home. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you would like to see more of these recipes, please like, share, and subscribe. And as always, until next time, thanks for watching.